As a longtime activist, educator, mother, grandmother, and recent recipient of the 2013 Vox Populi Award from the Oral History Association, this was given to Rosalie for outstanding achievement in using oral history to create a more just and humane world. From 2004 through 2007, Rosalie interviewed 173 war resistors who risked arrest and sometimes long prison terms to speak in the loudest way possible against U.S. militarism. The results of this project can be read in her recent books, Doing Time for Peace, Resistance, Family, and Community, Crossing the Line, Nonviolent Resisters Speak Out for Peace. And she's also the author of Voices from the Catholic Worker and Dorothy Day Portraits by Those Who Knew Her. I'm really happy today that we have 3 people who are featured in her. Is it just the Crossing the Line book? Hattie is in a different one?
Hattie's in this one.
Okay, great. The other 2, okay. So we have 3 local activists who are here today, Juanita Nelson and Randy Keeler, who are in Crossing the Line, and Hattie Nessel, who is in Doing Time for Peace. So I'm really happy that everybody's here today. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I'm glad to see students. I want lots of questions. I think what I'll be doing is speaking for maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes, and then turning it over to you and inviting you to ask questions for me and for Randy Keeler, and who I think will ask a question for Juanita Nelson, and to Hattie Nestle. Every time I give a book talk, and this is, I think, about my 78th one this year, they're different because the people that I interviewed are all different. People who cross the line are basically like you and me. We're all different. We all come with different motivations. We all have different experiences in jail and prison. How did I get into this? I think it was 1983, I finally got tenure at the college where I taught in Michigan. And when you have tenure, you can do what you want. So instead of writing about literature and composition, where I had my doctoral training, I decided to become an oral historian. I became an oral historian because I wanted to find out about the Catholic worker movement by those who lived it. So that's why I wrote the first book, Voices from the Catholic Worker. I didn't get it out of my craw. I was still fascinated by Catholic workers. And so in 1995, I and other friends started a Catholic worker house in Saginaw, Michigan, where I lived for 10 years before retiring from teaching and the Catholic worker, and moving to Illinois. At that time, then, I had more chance, more opportunity to do something that's very important to Catholic workers, which is resisting the wars, and doing resistance in things that keep us from making a world where it's easier to be good, one of the base beliefs of the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy Day, who was co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, said, you know, things ought to be a little easier for people. There ought to be so many poor, so many people that don't have what they need to live. And one of the reasons they don't have it is because of our intense concentration on war. So in 2003, I published my second book, Dorothy Day Portraits by Those Who Knew Her, because I wanted to show people the Dorothy Day that people lived with, the Dorothy Day that people loved, not the Dorothy Day that is sometimes in danger of being sanctified out of existence. So this book, which contains a wonderful introduction by her granddaughter, Kate Hennessy, is an attempt to show that Dorothy Day was in many ways like us. She had a tremendous sense of humor, a tremendous sense of spirituality, much deeper than anything I'm sure I could ever attain. But she was also just wonderful to be with. She also sometimes was angry, sometimes impatient. In short, a regular person with a very deep and compelling spiritual life and a very deep desire to show other people how to live the life. And that's what the Catholic Worker does in 277, I think it is, Catholic Worker houses throughout the world today. So this is my second book. But when I moved to Evanston, I had more time to get back to what had originally drawn me to the Catholic Worker, which was resisting war. I was blessed to meet Dorothy only once, and that was in 1968. And I said, she kept us smooth during the Vietnam War, because her insistence on keeping to nonviolence during direct action, I think, kept not only inspired people that were living with her in New York City, but inspired people all over the country to keep to the nonviolence, including inspiring people at our Catholic Worker House in Saginaw. So in 2003, I was getting more into that. Found myself crossing the line at Offutt Air Force Base in the middle of the country. It's there because it's a SAC command, Strategic Air Command, with the button on the nuclear missiles that can blow up the world many times over. It was a very simple, very almost prayerful action. We just crossed the line, knelt down, said a prayer, and were arrested. Very low key. But I was facing 6 months. And I thought, ooh, what can I do? What would I be if I'm in prison for 6 months? What's it going to be like? Well, I didn't get 6 months. We did have a trial. We were found guilty and just fined. Because I was a first-time offender at that place, I didn't get sent to jail. Thank goodness, because I didn't really know what I was doing. I decided I better learn, and these two books are a result. Early on, I learned that those who do time for peace don't do it alone. Resistance, family, and community. I think those two words are probably among the most important. They don't go alone. They come from a community. They return to a community, God willing. And it's the community that in many ways does the time. So the first book is organized around that. And it's this book that I have stories of 3 mothers who are resistors. And I rather arbitrarily, I have lots of mothers who are resistors. But Hattie Nestle, as coming from the Jewish tradition. Frances Crowe, who I think many of you know, coming from a Quaker tradition. And a woman you probably don't know, Joni McCoy, from my town where I lived for 30 years in Saginaw, coming from a Roman Catholic tradition. But all 3 of them very much speaking as mothers, feeling responsibility for the next generations. So those stories are in this book. I basically just had too many interviews, too many good interviews to fit into one book. Nobody will publish a book this big anymore. So Whiffenstock published my second book, same project, all different interviews, called Crossing the Line. And I say this one is a little more historical in that I have many more Vietnam stories. I have some Vietnam stories in the first book and one World War II CO story. In this book, I have stories of 4 conscientious objectors during the Second World War, including Ralph de Gia, who worked for years and years with War Resisters League afterwards. To give you an idea of how different things were then, when Ralph did not come from a religious perspective, I mean, I think he came as the son of Irish Italian socialists who just knew war was wrong. And his mother was very worried about his going to prison, but she said, you got to do it, you got to do it. Anyway, so he went to the draft board and said he would not serve, and he couldn't get a CO because it didn't have the religious conviction, they sent him to the War Resisters League for help in his defense when he had a trial. Now, I don't think we have that kind of cooperation in the War Resisters League nowadays between the federal government, but in those days they did. I'm on the board of War Resisters League and was just thrilled last week in New York to see Dan Ellsberg Joan Baez, and Harry Belafonte receive these lifetime awards for the cause of peace. And Randy was there, and Dan gave Randy his award. And you know why? Because it was Randy Keeler whose witness as a Vietnam draft resistor inspired Daniel Ellsberg to make the decision to follow his conscience and publish the Pentagon Papers. So don't let anybody tell you that direct action, that following your conscience, doesn't make a difference. People are always asking me, why do folks do this? And of course, both books, I think, talk a lot about motivation. And I try not to make conclusions. I want people to read my stories and draw their own conclusions. But almost everybody who gets involved in resistance does it because of meeting someone else who also follows their conscience. You know, you get it from personal connections. And I think, you know, probably you can see that often in your own life. I know I've been changed by the people that I interviewed. Sometimes I think my children are a little worried. I wrote this and then I became a Catholic worker. I write this, does it mean I'm going to be in jail in the next couple days? Who knows? I was arrested last, actually, at a Creech demonstration, and the judge dismissed the charges. And I was glad because I was finishing up the books, and going to jail is inconvenient, as anybody who's done it knows. Your life goes on hold. You can't finish projects. You don't get your glass of wine at 5 o'clock or your dental floss. You know, going to jail is not fun. But as the stories tell here, it's doable. It's eminently doable. And I think one of the reasons we don't see more direct action is, unfortunately, two institutions that I've been pretty much connected with all my life: motherhood. And no matter how wonderful mothers are, mothers want their kids to obey. As when Hattie was trying to convince her son not to go to the academy, she said, "You just can't kill people, Dad. You can't kill people." I mean, mothers tell kids what to do. They teach them to obey. And what do teachers do? Our whole educational system is predicated on obedience. And, you know, going to classes, doing your papers, following the syllabus, coming to this talk. It's all obedience. Dan Berrigan, and I put this poem in here, has a poem called "The Trouble with Our State." And he talks about the fact that, you know, we're too obedient. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to get rid of our 3 square meals a day. As he ends the poem, "The trouble with our state, the trouble with our soul, is civil obedience." And I just think that's something we need to really think long and hard about. What is it in our psyche that makes us be obedient to a state that does things that we know we're against? You know, what makes us take the status quo when we should be speaking out, as these people I interviewed did? I want to celebrate today, in particular, some people who spoke out at Hancock last winter. Hancock up in Syracuse, and I don't have the details. I didn't have a printer to print this out today. But 5 Catholic workers went on trial at 5 o'clock last night. An odd time to go to trial. But they went on trial up in Syracuse at 5 o'clock last night. They were acquitted. The judge ruled on something called, and maybe Randy can help me on this, mens rea. He said that they had not, they did their trespass action, really not a tremendously serious charge for good, for a greater good, that their intent was good. And I don't have all the details of it, but this was a very rare acquittal. Many people are going to jail for drone protests. One of the people in my second book, Jerry Ebner, who's done some serious protests, is in jail now for a drone protest. Brian Tyrrell was in jail all summer, at federal prison all summer. So people are going to jail every month for drone protests, and having this acquittal is just extremely good. So I thought I'd talk about another acquittal today that happened during the Vietnam War, and it's sort of interesting because John Grady was involved in this action during the Vietnam War, and his daughter, Ellen Grady of Ithaca, was one of the women who was acquitted yesterday. And a granddaughter of his, Anna Flores Grady, was probably the youngest activist I interviewed. She did an action and went through a trial as a youth, as a teenager in Ithaca before the Second World War. And her story is in here, how she did a die-in at the recruiting center in the build-up to the war and was prosecuted and had to go to trial. Finally, the judge let them off with community service, but it was a tremendously long process for these young teenagers. So we have 3 generations of Gradys, and I'm just going to briefly tell this story of an amazing acquittal that happened in the Second World War, and we're really hoping that more of this kind of thing will happen. Some of you may remember, and many of you are way too young to remember, an action during the Second World War called the Camden 28.
Rosalie, do you mean the Second World War?
Excuse me, Vietnam War. I've got to be in chapter 2, not 1. Yes, thank you. The Camden 28 did a draft file destruction action. There were probably over 100 of these actions during the Vietnam War, and several of them are recorded in this book. But the Camden 28 was a late action. At first, the men and women who did these draft file destruction actions would wait around for arrest. In fact, most of them did that. They did the action. Sometimes they had to even call the police. They either shredded or burned or poured blood, usually those are the 3 things, on draft files, because draft files are improper property. Those are Dan Berrigan's words, for property that doesn't have a right to exist. It kills people. It kills the men that had the draft cards and had the draft file, and it kills the people they kill in war. Mike Giocondo was a member of the Camden 28 that I was privileged to interview. He had been a Franciscan, and he said there'd been a number of standby draft board actions, like that as I described. They did their thing and waited for the police to come, but we were going to do that. We'd go into the draft board by destroy the records and not wait around to be arrested. So this was later on in the Vietnam War, and people were moving to more dramatic but still nonviolent actions. Now, there are lots of violent actions in the Vietnam War, and I just didn't have anything to do with them. I think that the only way we're going to make change is nonviolence. I'm not going to be honoring people that burn down buildings in Madison, things like that. I do honor these people. So Mike got involved with this action, and they did a big, long planning thing. He recruited a friend of his, he'd known him all his life, named Bob Hardy. And Bob was very helpful in getting ladders and walkie-talkies because they had people posted out on the street and everything. So the night of the action, they broke into the building. It was a big post office building, the draft board on the top floors. And Mike tells me, all of a sudden, I hear, freeze, it's the FBI. Just like on the radio programs he'd listened to as a kid. The FBI was in the room with him. They had been infiltrated. Guess who infiltrated them? Bob Hardy, Mike's friend. If you can imagine how he felt. They get to the jail. They're all facing felony charges, 47 years in prison they were facing. Mike wasn't there. He wasn't arrested. They picked up a lot of people on the street. Mike wasn't arrested. And finally, they put two and two together. Everybody had trusted Bob. I just found it hard to believe he'd gone to the FBI and agreed to become an informant. Right after I'd asked him to join us, I felt incredibly guilty and felt that others thought it was my fault too. So he was not only upset with the betrayal of trust to his friends, but he thought he had been, between he and Mike, but he'd betrayed the whole crowd. And the FBI let them get away with it, get all the files shredded. They were cutting up files and everything, and then arrested them so they'd have plenty of proof. Mike says, I was a peace-loving guy, and his betrayal was the most cataclysmic thing that had ever happened to me. And he's still, all these years later, when I interviewed him in 2007, it still bothered him to talk about it. But they had this huge trial, and during the trial, Bob Hardy recanted, went over to the defense, left his FBI buddies, and went back to his friend. Because, as he said, the FBI deceived him. They said, if you spy on us, spy on them for us, we will promise that they won't go to jail. And then they were hitting him with 47 years. Because they wanted particularly to get John Grady. John Grady had been behind and not arrested in quite a few of these actions, including an action that never did get any arrest in Media, Pennsylvania, where they broke into the FBI offices and stole documents that proved that the FBI was using terrorist kind of tactics to do surveillance on the peace movement. So they had the goods on the FBI, and the FBI knew it. And nobody has ever yet been arrested for that action, but now people are willing to talk, but nobody has really said, I did it yet, at least for the record. But we're pretty sure that John Grady, who's now passed on, did it. Anyway, so they're in the middle of this huge trial, lots of publicity. Bob Hardy goes over to the defense and says, the FBI shouldn't have done that. They entrapped these people. They had a wonderful jury. They had a wonderful judge. And the judge did instruct the jury that they could acquit. They could acquit on an entrapment, which is illegal. They could also acquit on something that we really hope is something that we can use in trials today, called jury nullification. It's a precedent going back to slavery times, where the jury can refuse to convict when the law would punish someone doing the morally right thing. It was quite close to what the judge in Syracuse did last night, saying that they did a good thing in alerting us that the drones are dangerous. So this Camden 28 was acquitted in a very dramatic turnaround, partly because Bob Hardy got his conscience back. So, very dramatic story. As Mike said, it's still the #1 part in my life. And he said, it really expressed the way I was feeling. I was really following my conscience, and am feeling even now. We were tearing up papers, and they were destroying lives, killing people in Vietnam. But now, I don't know, during the Vietnam times, you felt you were making some kind of progress. And I think many of us feel that way today, that there was a time when things happened, when Randy Keeler could go to prison as a draft refuser and come out and work with Roy Resistors League and feel that maybe he was making a difference, that we were going to change things. It's hard to keep that today. When I was doing this second book, this book came out in November, and I was already on tour with it and trying to finish this, and really feeling kind of hopeless because I felt so powerless, and I think many times we feel that. We feel that Washington doesn't listen. They don't listen to the people. So I put this book together particularly. I put this book together concentrating on families, and I'll really be glad to talk about that in the discussion period. I put this book together partly to give myself hope, partly to keep myself coming on. One thing I chose was a little paragraph from Victor Havel, who says, "Hope is a state of mind, not of the world, a dimension of the soul, not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world as it is at the moment. It's not the same thing as optimism." I love this. "It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, because let's face it, it doesn't, and we don't often get wonderful acquittals like we did last night. And sometimes we go to prison and it just seems it's not worth it." But Havel says, "It's the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it comes out." So I chose that as the beginning. And I also chose a decision that a judge made just in 2012, just a couple years, about a year ago today, actually. Remember when Occupy Wall Street was crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, and a whole lot of people were arrested, wrongfully arrested. They put a wrongful arrest suit against the police, and the police lost. The occupiers won, and the judge in the decision said, "What a huge debt this nation owes to its troublemakers, because they force us to focus on problems we would prefer to downplay or ignore." You know, the United States is crazy about bread and circuses, and so like the media can only keep stuff in their mind for a couple minutes, and then you're on to something else. He says, "Only with hindsight can we distinguish these troublemakers from simply troublemakers." So, prudence, respect for the constitutional rights to free speech and free association dictate that the legal system cut all nonviolent protesters a fair amount of slack. So he finds for the defense, and he concludes by calling on other judges to do that too. So we do see some movement. At the end of the book, I put an interview by Grace Paley, who was an icon of my young teaching days. I taught her short stories. I would see her once in a while at a conference, but you know, she was kind of famous, and I was just a teacher at a small college. I was able to interview her shortly before she died of breast cancer, and it was a very poignant moment, almost as poignant as when I interviewed Michael Harrington shortly before he died, and that story is told in this book. And at the end of her interview, we're talking about who should get arrested, and she said, you know, young African-American women with families who would lose their job if they're arrested, people like us have to get arrested for them because we have the freedom to do it. Nobody's going to starve if I go to jail, but some people, just really can't. So people with the freedom, people who don't have that kind of responsibilities, have to do it. And then she paused, and she said, "I'll tell you one hope I have." And I'm going, the time before this latest Iraq war is the first time in history that every nation in this new world, Europe and America, was opposed to us beginning a war. There have been lots of times when people have been trying to stop a war, and of course I talk about this in the books, but there's never been a time before when everyone was trying to prevent a war from happening. So I tell the kids, we'd been talking about Code Pink and the people in Vermont that she had been meeting with, remember this, in your time, this happened. So I took that as the end of the book because I want to remember that people can work together. And I think a couple weeks ago we saw that happen when we were pulled back from the brink of Syria. Now, I'm not sure I think the story's still out on Syria. I'm not trusting Washington at all on that, but at least for now, we're not lobbing bombs in the Middle East. We are sending our drones, Lord knows where, but we don't have missiles going over there at the moment. So people power does work. It worked in nuclear power, and it's still working in nuclear power. We're doing a direct action affinity group training in Evanston the Sunday I get back for direct action against Keystone Pipeline. So there's a lot of things happening. There will be a lot of people doing direct action. There'll be, I think, it's staying nonviolent. People are remembering all the wonderful lessons from the 80s, from the big campaigns against nuclear power, against the Trident submarines, learning the lessons, passing them on, but not in a kind of paternalistic way, but in a sharing way. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. At the end of this book, I have a poem that a colleague, a Catholic worker colleague of mine, wrote when we were protesting against the Iraq War. And in the whole poem, there's a lot of images about, because I didn't stay out all night, but the young people would stay out all night protesting. And they'd build a fire, and people would bring them coffee. And it went from having a lot of, we had a lot of resistance when we started the protest. We'd had a tremendous amount of support before the war started. Lots of people, teach-ins at the college, and presidents supporting us. And, we had lots of support then. As soon as the war started, man, everybody went home except about 5 people. And there were lots of people waving flags and being kind of nasty and saying they were going to take our kids away and stuff. But they went home, too. And these young people stayed all night. And he wrote a poem about it. And the image that I just love is he said, if we tie our sweaters together and live in community, we can refuse and continue to refuse. So I use that to end this book, because this book talks about people here today in this audience who know the value of community and know that you can't do it alone.